Thank you for watching this video from the Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue at Carleton University. This event is sponsored by the Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue, CETD, and the Faculty of Public Affairs Research Month at Carleton University. CETD receives funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The views expressed in this video are solely those of the presenter and do not reflect the views of the CETD, SHRC, or Carleton University.
Thank you very much. So here is another challenge, not only talk about EU policy towards the Middle East, but also Canada's policy towards the Middle East, and why not also add a comparison between the policies in 10 minutes, of course. So I will start by looking at the very object of the title, so the Middle East. First of all, what do we mean by the Middle East in this case? And I think it's quite important because, in fact, when you analyze Canadian policy and European policy, the definition of the region itself and how the region is viewed already gives us something, some food for thought. Obviously, the Middle East could go conceivably from North Africa to the Maghreb, to the Mashrek, and all the way to the Gulf. So the question that we can pose is, how do these two actors look at the region? Do they look at the region as a whole, or do they look at the subregions, and do they develop specific policy to deal with the region as a whole, or do they engage mostly in bilateral relations? And if we look at, and we're looking, let's say, at the last 10 years, more or less, I would say that the EU has tried to do a little bit of both, in the sense that it has tried to develop at least a concept for what they call, or what the European Union called, the Mediterranean, which is the immediate neighborhood, obviously, and for cultural reason, political reason, geostrategic reason, is of immediate importance for the European Union. So the EU has developed and continues to attempt to develop a coherent regional framework for dialogue with partners at the southern shore of the Mediterranean. And it has done this through the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership, which has then been renewed into the Union for the Mediterranean. Now, I'm not a diplomat, so I will go out on a limb and say it has not been quite entirely successful. Because while I think the EU has well analyzed the region, and in fact, a lot of the analysis that were done on the problems stemming from the region already gave any analyst, anyone who's interested in the region, an understanding of the potential for instability and what are the reason for this potential instability. At the same time, the EU has met with many obstacles in trying to develop this approach, comprehensive approach to the Mediterranean region. And this is not necessarily the fault of the EU, but unavoidably, when you design an approach that brings together countries that have very different priorities and very different agendas, you find great obstacles. So in particular, what I'm referring to is the fact that the EU has tried to promote in the Mediterranean, and again, in this Mediterranean, we include countries that in fact are both in the Maghreb and partly also in the Mashrek, has tried to develop programs, for example, that look at the development of civil society, transparency, et cetera, but it has been somehow blocked in these attempts by the realities of the region. So the fact that it's very difficult to develop with governments of the region programs for accountability and transparency when those very governments had the most to lose by introducing accountability and transparency. So we can see that this, there is an attempt at conceptualizing the region while at the same time there are problems in implementing these programs. The EU has at the same time also tried to develop a framework for bilateral relations, which are not exactly bilateral in a traditional sense, given that the EU obviously is not a state. So through the European Neighborhood Policy has developed a sort of variable geometry with a different type of integration that are really defined and measured by how interested the partner country is in having a certain level of interaction with the EU itself. And this has been going on for more than 10 years now, has been renewed again after 2011 and the Arab Spring, and again, as Alan mentioned, more recently. Now, what about Canada? If we look at the Canadian side, I would say that if we look at the last 10 or so years, the majority of Canada's outlook on the region has been founded on two pillars. On the one end, we've had the development of bilateral relations with countries in the region, mostly driven by economic interest. And on the other hand, Canada has maintained over the years, and not just over the last 10 years, but much longer than that, a greatest interest in having some kind of role as an honest broker, as Canada defined itself, in the Arab-Israeli conflict. And this kind of brings us to the other big elephant in the room. If we're looking at the Middle East and major policies and issues stemming from the Middle East, how have the EU and Canada compare in their role in the Arab-Israeli peace process and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And very quickly, obviously, I would say that this has been an issue for Canada consistently for way more than 10 years. Canada has viewed itself as an honest broker, but it has it has really a limited role because its potential for really impacting the peace process is limited. And if we think about how many failures the United States, who have way more instruments to impact the peace process, have, and how many failures they have had, we can imagine that Canada has to have limited ambitions and is constrained by the situation on the ground and by the involvement of other powers. We have seen in the last 10 years a slight departure at least on rhetoric, from this idea of the honest broker with the Harper government. And I would say we have to make a distinction. So Canada's policy has mostly been that of trying to be a honest broker, voting at the UN, fairly close to European Union member states, especially to the Nordic countries. In the last 10 years with the Harper government, there has been a departure, certainly in rhetoric, from that traditional position. The substance of Canadian foreign policy hasn't really changed that much, at least on the level of what is written on the website of the Canadian DFAT-DGAC, or the view of settlements are illegal, et cetera, et cetera. But the rhetoric has changed, at least until the elections. So now we don't really know. It's very early times. I think we're going to see probably an attempt at rebalancing the rhetoric, but I would not claim that there has been a huge difference really across government from Martin to Harper, and we'll see with Trudeau, on the real substance of the general guidelines of the policy. The EU has had also ambitions to have a role in the Arab-Israeli issue, and it has become, over the years, one of the main donors of the Palestinian Authority, has had a huge commitment financially to the peace process, but has also been restrained and constrained in its role by the reality of the peace process and the presence of the United States as a major mediator, although not necessarily quite that effective. So moving on two more issues, I would say that, again, looking at challenges stemming from the region, and there are many more, but we have to select some. It's interesting to compare and contrast the relationship between Canada and Iran and the European Union and Iran, particularly on the nuclear program, on the Iranian nuclear program. And I would say that here we see really quite a stark difference, especially obviously starting from 2012. The European Union, and here I go back a little bit to Alan's comment on using this variable geometry of member state action and EU level action. The EU has been involved in the negotiation with Iran on the nuclear program since the beginning, both in the format of the EU3, so Germany, UK, and France, and the so-called P5+1, so the permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany. And
which officially is called the E3+3.
Exactly, I was going on it. Depending on who you ask, it might be the P5+1.
It's in all documents, it's E3+3. It's
not everywhere.
In the documents, it's E3+3.
And in fact, Lady Ashton, who was the predecessor of Mogherini in the position of High Representative for the CFSP, was very involved in the dialogue and as a mediator in the first person. Now, on the Canadian side, we see really in the past years, and this has left the new government, again, probably a privilege of academia, can say as it is, in a bit of a bind right now, because since 2012, obviously, Canada does not have relations with Iran. So the choice has been that of withdrawing this relation in order to send a signal on what that means for Canada. Iran is viewed as funding terror, as a major violator of human rights, and therefore the breaking of the relationship for a variety of reasons. But this, I would argue, has also shut out Canada from any possibility of playing, at least in the open, a role in these negotiations. And I think my impression, the reading of the first months of the Trudeau government, is that this government views being there as an element. So there is not a mutually exclusive relationship between condemning bad human rights record and having a dialogue. You can have a dialogue officially and condemn your interlocutor for violation of human rights or for violation of international agreements. So obviously this is not going to be easy to do because of various laws that have been passed in Canada that make it particularly difficult for Canada to reestablish this relation with Iran. So I would say a very different relationship here, obviously, with EU having developed its role and really work to have an important role in this negotiation. I would close with ISIS or ISIL or Daesh, however you prefer to name the organization. A challenge for the entire world, certainly a challenge, a different challenge for Europe because of geographical proximity and the immediate impact that this has on daily life and in Europe. And the potential, of course, for attacks, the potential for nationals returning after having been involved in fighting on behalf of ISIS, etc. I think that this is a threat for Canada as well, and I think the government also sees ISIS as a threat. The government of Canada has indicated that the role of Canada, the best role for Canada, would not be a combat role, but rather a training role and a support role for the training of personnel, but also support of other countries that are fighting on the ground. Obviously, in this case, the European, and particularly in this case, we're talking about member states, have a different type of action, and they are present with maybe not technically boots on the ground, but planes in the sky, and are participating robustly to the military action. I think this is a challenge, and as we mentioned, for both Canada, for the EU, and obviously for the Transatlantic Alliance and the United States as well. And the role of Canada, even if it shifts its role out of combat and into a different dimension, will remain that of assisting the mission and coordinating with the EU. Obviously, from here we go into the refugee crisis, which is kind of internal, external security threat, against something else in which Canada and the EU have to cooperate to the best of their ability in the immediate future. And I have to stop.